On Sunday, the 26th of July, China ran two weather emergencies at the same time, about 1,500 kilometers apart. The first was the strongest typhoon to strike the country this year, making landfall before dawn on a coastline holding more than 100 million people. The second was a stream in a narrow valley that rose in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. The typhoon killed essentially nobody in the province it hit. The stream killed 10. I want to put those two facts next to each other and leave them there for a second, because almost every instinct you have about disaster response points the wrong way here. The enormous, headline-generating, satellite-tracked event was survivable. The small, local, barely reported one was not. That difference was not luck. It was not a story about one province being better prepared than another. Both were handled by the same national system, under the same government, in the same week, and both were assigned the same lowest tier national response. The variable that decided who lived was time. Specifically, about 72 hours in one case, and something closer to 10 minutes in the other. In the next 20 minutes, I'll take you through both events, show you exactly where the warning time comes from, and why it differs so enormously between two kinds of water, explain what a country can and cannot do with each amount, and identify where the Chinese system genuinely is under strain. Because there's a real answer to that, and it isn't the one in the headlines. Let's take them in order. The first event began days before it arrived, which is the whole point. Typhoon Noel had already crossed the Philippines earlier in the week, where at least 3 people died. It tracked northwest across the South China Sea, past Taiwan, and by Saturday it was intensifying, with Hong Kong's observatory measuring maximum sustained winds near 90 miles an hour. Saturday evening, China's National Meteorological Center issued a red typhoon warning, the highest level in a 4-tier color system, and the first red typhoon alert issued anywhere in the country in 2026. At around 10 minutes to 4 on Sunday morning, Noel made landfall at Huidong County in Huizhou, Guangdong Province, with winds up to 162 kilometers an hour. Then it weakened quickly, dropping to tropical storm strength as it moved inland. The alert was stepped down to orange, then to yellow, through the day. The reported damage was uprooted trees in Huilai County, a partially collapsed scaffolding structure on a Hong Kong high-rise, and rain across southern Guangdong and southeastern Fujian. Hong Kong reported at least 9 people injured. Around 1,800 flights were grounded across the affected region, and high-speed rail across Guangdong was canceled for the day. And according to Xinhua, more than 801,000 people in Guangdong had been relocated for safety by Sunday. 2 days earlier, that figure had been around 340,000, which means roughly 500,000 people were moved in the final stretch. Afterwards, the National Commission for Disaster Prevention, Reduction and Relief activated a Level 4 response for the province, the lowest of 4 national tiers. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan, about 14.8 million US dollars, for recovery. Now the second event. At around 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, in the Shuangshimen Scenic Area in Weiwan County, Dingxi City, Gansu Province, inland, northwest, roughly 1,200 kilometers from Beijing and far outside anything the typhoon touched, short-duration heavy rainfall in the mountains produced what Chinese media described as a mountain torrent. It came down a narrow valley into a scenic area full of people camping on a summer weekend. 305 firefighters and rescue personnel were deployed with 68 emergency vehicles. Local police and fire teams searched vehicles for people trapped inside them. By 6 o'clock that evening, the toll stood at 10 dead and 23 injured. 174 people were rescued. The State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters, with the Ministry of Emergency Management, sent a work team to Gansu and activated a Level 4 flood prevention response for the province. 2 events. Same day. Same lowest response tier. Wildly different outcomes. So here is the variable. A typhoon is one of the most visible things on Earth. It is a weather system hundreds of kilometers across, sitting on open ocean, tracked continuously by geostationary satellites, aircraft, buoys, and radar. Forecasters can see it forming days before it threatens anyone, watch it organize, and project its track with increasing confidence as it approaches. By the time Noel was a day out from Guangdong, its landfall zone was known to within a manageable margin. That gave the Chinese system somewhere in the region of 72 hours of actionable warning. Not perfect information, but enough to act on with confidence. A mountain torrent gives you almost nothing. The rainfall that produces one is convective, localized, intense, and short. A single storm cell parks over one catchment in a mountain range and empties itself in under an hour across an area a few kilometers wide. Forecasters can tell you that conditions across a large mountainous region are favorable for intense downpours. They cannot tell you which of several hundred valleys will receive the cell, or at what hour. And once it starts, the clock is brutal. Rain falling across a steep catchment concentrates into the valley floor within minutes. From the moment a torrent begins in the upper catchment to the moment it reaches a site a few kilometers downstream, you may have somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes. 72 hours against 10 minutes. That is the entire difference, and everything else follows from it. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear that as an excuse. It isn't one. It is a description of what the two kinds of water physically permit, and it explains why the response to each looks so different. Consider what 72 hours buys you. 800 and 1,000 relocations is not a warning. It is a logistics operation on the scale of moving a mid-sized city. It requires identifying which villages, fishing communities, low-lying districts, and construction sites fall inside the projected zone. It requires shelters, schools, gymnasiums, community halls, designated and stocked in advance. It requires transport, and the transport has to finish moving people before conditions make roads impassable. Which means the whole operation must complete hours before the storm arrives, not as it arrives. It also requires the authority to compel people to leave. Evacuation orders in China are not advisory in the way they often are elsewhere, and whatever you think of that as a general principle, on a weekend in July in Guangdong, it is the reason the death toll is what it is. Now consider what 10 minutes buys you. Essentially nothing that involves organizing people. And the geometry makes it worse. A person standing in a narrow valley cannot see the sky above the catchment feeding it. The rain that kills you in a mountain torrent often falls kilometers upstream, out of sight, and it may not be raining where you are standing at all. This is the single most counterintuitive fact about these events, and it accounts for a large share of the deaths worldwide. People are caught in bright conditions beside a stream that looks completely normal. Add the communications problem. Deep mountain valleys are precisely where mobile coverage fails. A push alert sent to every phone in the county does not reach the campsite at the bottom of the gorge. So on Sunday afternoon, a system that had just successfully relocated 800,000 people from a coastline had no meaningful mechanism to reach a few hundred campers in a canyon. Because the physics of the hazard did not allow one, that is why the outcomes diverged. Not competence. Lead time. Now, is the Chinese system under strain? There is a real answer, and it is worth separating from the noise. Noel was the third typhoon to make landfall in China within a single month after Bavi and Maysak. That compression is the genuine pressure point, and for a reason that has nothing to do with wind speed. Emergency response capacity is finite. The same provincial teams, the same shelters, the same stockpiles, the same drainage systems, and the same repair crews handle each event in turn. Spaced across a season, the system recovers between them. Arriving in close succession, each event lands on ground that has not dried, infrastructure that has not been fully repaired, and personnel who have not rested. Saturated soil is the clearest illustration. Rainfall that would drain harmlessly into dry ground runs straight off ground that is already full. So the same rain produces more flooding on the second storm than the first, and more again on the third. Nothing about the weather changed. The ground underneath it did. Running two concurrent level 4 responses in different provinces is not, in itself, evidence of a system at its limit. Level 4 is the lowest tier precisely because it does not require the heaviest national mobilization. But 3 landfalls in 30 days, entering the historical peak of the Western Pacific typhoon season in August and September, is a real load, and it is the thing worth watching rather than any individual storm. There is one more failure in this story, and it is not China's. A significant number of outlets reported the 10 Gansu deaths under typhoon headlines. Typhoon Noel kills 10 in China. The Associated Press and ABC News reported the two events separately and clearly, but because both stories carried the words China, rain, flooding, and deaths, and because both landed in the same news cycle, they were fused. It is a compression error, not a conspiracy, and it happens constantly with fast-moving disaster coverage. But it does real damage to public understanding, because it produces exactly the wrong lesson. If you believe Noel killed 10 people in Guangdong, you conclude that a typhoon hit China and some people died, which is unremarkable. If you understand that the typhoon killed almost nobody, and a stream killed 10, you are forced to ask why, and the answer is genuinely useful. So let me be direct about what this weekend does and does not show. It does not show a country overwhelmed. Both events were assessed at the lowest national response tier by the government's own commission, and the funding allocated for Guangdong recovery was around $15 million, a serious sum for cleanup, and nowhere near what a devastated province would require. It does not show cities flattened or millions trapped. The reported physical damage from Noel was trees, scaffolding, flooding, and canceled transport. The 801,000 figure describes people moved out of danger, which is the opposite of trapped, and it is good news that is frequently reported as though it were bad, and it does not show anything engineered. Both events are ordinary meteorology for late July, a typhoon forming in the Western Pacific warm pool at the seasonal peak, and convective thunderstorms over mountains in summer. The energy involved in either exceeds anything human technology can direct by margins that are difficult to express. But it also does not show a country that has solved the problem, and this is where I part company with the reassuring reading. 10 people died in a valley on a Sunday afternoon in a country with one of the most capable mass evacuation systems in the world. They died because the hazard that killed them operates on a timescale that no evacuation system can match, and because the site they were standing in had been developed for tourism in exactly the kind of terrain that produces those events. That is the uncomfortable part. The features that make a scenic gorge beautiful, narrow walls, dramatic rock, clear mountain streams, are the visible signature of a catchment that moves a great deal of water very fast. The valley is beautiful because it was carved, and it was carved by what happened on Sunday. Domestic tourism in China has expanded enormously over 2 decades, and camping specifically has grown sharply in recent years. That puts far more people into upland valleys during storm season than were there a decade ago. The hazard has not changed. The exposure has. The interventions that work against that are unglamorous and cheap, where you site a campsite within a valley, how much elevation above the channel you require, whether upstream rain gauges feed a local siren rather than a national app, whether visitors are told on arrival what a distant roar means and which direction to run, uphill and away from the channel, immediately, not along the valley floor. None of that requires better forecasting. All of it works inside a 10-minute window, which is the only window you get. Here is what I'll be watching over the coming days. The first is the final Gansu toll. 10 was accurate as of 6 o'clock Sunday evening. Numbers after mountain torrents move, because people are carried downstream and search areas expand along the channel. Watch for a missing persons count reported separately from confirmed deaths. That is the better predictor of where the total lands. The second is whether either level 4 response is escalated. That is the clearest available signal that a damage assessment came back worse than the initial read. The third is the findings of the work team dispatched to Gansu. Investigations after events like this typically address whether warnings were issued, whether the site had an evacuation plan, and whether facilities were sited appropriately relative to the channel. Whether those findings are published, and in what detail, tells you how the incident is being treated. The fourth is rainfall across both regions this week. Saturated and destabilized ground fails more readily on subsequent rain, and the days after an event are when secondary incidents happen, in the same catchments. The fifth is what forms next in the Western Pacific. 3 landfalls in a month is already an unusual cadence, and August and September are historically the strongest months of the season. I want to end on the contrast, because I think it is the most useful thing anyone can take from last weekend. At 4 in the morning on Sunday, on the Guangdong coast, a typhoon came ashore into a province that had already emptied the ground in front of it. Buses had run. Shelters had opened. Boats had come into harbor. Trains had stopped. Somebody had made a list of which communities sat inside the projected zone, and somebody else had gone out to them. It was the least watchable form of disaster response there is. It generated no footage anyone will remember. And it is the reason the death toll was what it was. 10 hours later, and 1,500 kilometers inland, a few hundred people were camping beside a stream in a valley on their day off. Somewhere above them, out of sight beyond a ridge, it started raining hard. Most of them got out. 305 rescuers came up the road and pulled 174 people out alive. 10 did not get out. The country did not fail on Sunday. It did the thing it is good at, extremely well, and then ran into the thing that nobody is good at yet. We'll be watching for the final figures. The evacuation of Guangdong did not begin with a siren, and it did not begin on land. It began at noon on Friday in the South China Sea, when thousands of offshore workers, including crews on oil platforms, completed their evacuation from installations off the coast. 64 hours before the storm arrived, the first people moved were the ones furthest out. By Sunday morning, more than 801,000 people had been relocated in Guangdong province ahead of Typhoon Noel, the strongest typhoon to strike China this year, which came ashore near the town of Pinghai at 10 minutes to 4 in the morning, carrying winds of 162 kilometers an hour. Almost nobody in that province died. I've covered what that outcome means elsewhere. This report is about the mechanism. How does a country actually move 800,000 people in roughly 48 hours, finish before the weather closes the roads, and get them all somewhere with food and a floor? In the next 30 minutes, I'll take you through it as a system, the 4 separate emergency structures that were running simultaneously, the order in which people get moved, and why that order matters enormously. What happens to the boats? Who makes the decision about where the line goes on the map? The shutdown of an entire province's transport network as a deliberate safety measure, and the counterintuitive problem that Chinese researchers have identified as one of the biggest threats to an evacuation, which is too many people trying to leave. I'll also be honest about the parts of this that don't transfer, and the hazard the whole machine cannot touch. Let's start with something almost every English language report about this storm got wrong. There is not one emergency response for Typhoon Noel. There were 4, running in parallel, under different ministries, on different scales, covering different provinces. This is the single most misunderstood thing about Chinese disaster management, so let me lay it out properly. The first system is the meteorological warning. That is the 4-tier color code most people have heard of: blue, yellow, orange, red, with red the most severe. It is issued by the National Meteorological Center, and it describes the weather. Nothing more. It is a forecast product. The second system is the flood control and typhoon prevention emergency response. run through the State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters and the Ministry of Water Resources. It also has 4 tiers, but they run the other way, with level 4 the lowest and level 1 the most severe. This one describes what the state is doing, not what the sky is doing. The third system is the Geological Disaster Response, activated by the Ministry of Emergency Management. Also 4 tiers. This one is about landslides and slope failure, which is a completely different hazard from wind or coastal flooding and requires different specialists in different places. The fourth is the National Disaster Relief Response, activated by the National Commission for Disaster Prevention, Reduction and Relief. Again, 4 tiers. This one governs relief and recovery after the event. 4 separate ladders, all 4-tier, all active during this storm at different times, in different provinces at different levels. This is why coverage of Chinese disasters gets so confused. A headline saying China issues highest red alert and a headline saying China activates lowest level response are both accurate, describing different systems, and read together they look like a contradiction or a cover-up. They are neither. One is the forecast. The other is the mobilization. Now the timeline, because the sequencing is the whole story. Friday, the 24th of July, 2 days out. The State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters activated a Level 4 emergency response for flood control and typhoon prevention, not just in Guangdong, but in Fujian as well, the province up the coast. Note that the response covered the neighboring province before anyone knew precisely where landfall would be. Guangdong began shutting down its coastal operations. Passenger ferry routes in affected areas were suspended. Passenger vessels halted operations. And the Provincial Maritime Safety Administration set a deadline. Offshore workers, including those on oil platforms, would finish evacuating by noon. At the same time, rescue assets were pre-positioned. Vessels, helicopters, tugboats, and cleanup ships moved into place before they were needed, rather than after. Saturday, the 25th. 1 day out. By this point, around 340,000 people had been relocated in Guangdong. The Ministry of Water Resources activated a Level 4 flood control emergency response across 7 provincial-level regions: Fujian, Jiangxi, Henan, Hubei, Hunan, Guangdong, and Guangxi. That covers large parts of eastern, central, and southern China, and it flagged flood risk on some of the country's largest river systems, the Pearl, the Yangtze, and the Huaihe. Think about what that means. A storm that had not yet made landfall on the coast triggered flood preparations across 7 provinces, reaching 1,000 kilometers inland, on the basis that the rain would follow the storm north and west for days after the wind was gone. Also on Saturday, the Ministry of Emergency Management activated a Level 4 geological disaster response in Jiangxi and Hunan, 2 inland provinces the storm had not reached, while maintaining the existing geological response in Guangdong and Fujian. And on the water, 418 vessels were directed across jurisdictional boundaries to shelter in western Guangdong and Hainan province and in waters off northern Fujian. I want to dwell on that one, because it is the detail that tells you this is a genuine system rather than a series of local decisions. 418 boats were sent out of their own province's waters to shelter in someone else's. That requires provinces to accept each other's vessels at short notice, harbor capacity to be known and allocated centrally, and someone with authority over all of them to make the call. Saturday evening, the National Meteorological Center issued a red typhoon warning, the first red typhoon alert issued anywhere in China in 2026. Sunday, the 26th, 3:50 in the morning. Landfall, by Sunday, the relocation figure had passed 801,000. Roughly 500,000 people moved in the final stretch between Saturday's count and landfall. So how does that actually happen? Let me break the machine into its parts. Step 1 is drawing the line. Before anyone moves, somebody has to decide who is inside the danger zone. That is not a matter of drawing a circle around a forecast track. It is a hazard-specific assessment, which areas are exposed to storm surge based on elevation and coastal geometry, which slopes are at risk of failure given how saturated the ground already is, which districts flood in heavy rain because they always have, which structures are known to be vulnerable. Crucially, that mapping largely exists before the storm. It is maintained as standing risk registers at county and township level, updated after each event. When a typhoon forms, the work is not building the map. It is selecting which parts of an existing map to activate. That is the difference between a system and an emergency. An emergency invents the plan. A system retrieves it. Step 2 is the C, and the C always goes first. This is the part most coverage skips entirely, and it is where the highest risk population is. Anyone on the water when a typhoon arrives is in the most dangerous place available. Fishing vessels, aquaculture platforms, cargo ships, offshore energy installations. They cannot shelter in place in any meaningful sense, and they cannot be rescued during the storm because rescue assets themselves cannot operate in those conditions. So the maritime evacuation runs on the longest lead time, and it ran here on a hard deadline. Offshore workers off the platforms by noon Friday. Ferries stopped. Passenger vessels halted. Fishing fleets called in, with Jinhua drone footage on Saturday showing boats packed into harbor in rows at the Shenzhen Shanwei Special Cooperation Zone. And when local harbors filled, 418 vessels went to other provinces. Getting the fleet in early also solves a second problem. Every boat still at sea on Sunday morning would have been a potential rescue operation during the storm, consuming helicopters and crews that were needed elsewhere. Clearing the water on Friday is what makes Sunday manageable. Step 3 is the land relocation, and this is where the number comes from. The population being moved is not the general public. It is specific categories, identified in advance, and they go in a rough order of exposure. Fishing and coastal communities first, because they are lowest and closest. Then residents of low-lying districts subject to surge and flooding. Then construction sites and the temporary accommodation attached to them, and that category matters enormously for historical reasons I'll come back to. Then aquaculture operations, which sit on and beside the water by definition. Then anyone in structures known to be substandard, and residents of slopes flagged for landslide risk. Where do they go? Schools, gymnasiums, community halls, government buildings, designated in advance as shelters, and stocked before the season rather than during the crisis. That pre-stocking is unglamorous, and it is the difference between a shelter and a room. The mechanism that actually knocks on doors is the grassroots administrative layer, neighborhood committees, village committees, township cadres. Every residential area in China sits under an administrative unit with named people responsible for it. And those people have lists. When an evacuation order comes down, it does not go out as a general broadcast and hope. It resolves into a set of specific addresses assigned to specific individuals. That is the real answer to how 800,000 people move in 48 hours. Not a helicopter fleet. A very large number of people with clipboards who already knew which doors to knock on. Step 4 is the shutdown, and it is genuinely part of the evacuation rather than a consequence of it. High-speed rail across Guangdong was canceled for Sunday. Flights were canceled in large numbers, several hundred at Hong Kong International alone, with figures approaching 1,800 grounded across the wider affected region. It is easy to read that as disruption caused by the storm. It is better understood as a deliberate control measure. Stopping transport does two things. It prevents people traveling into the impact zone during the hours before landfall, and on a summer weekend on that coast, a great many people would otherwise have been arriving. And it clears the roads and rails for the evacuation itself, which needs the network more than commuters do. An evacuation running against normal weekend traffic is an evacuation that fails. Shutting the province down is how you give it room. Now the counterintuitive part, and this is the finding I found most interesting while putting this together. Chinese research on typhoon evacuation has identified a specific failure mode that has nothing to do with people refusing to leave. It is the opposite problem. Residents in areas that are actually safe joining the evacuation out of fear, driven by misunderstanding or a lack of information about the hazard. That has, in past events, interfered with evacuation orders and consumed resources needed by the people genuinely at risk. It makes sense once you see it. Shelter capacity is finite. Roads are finite. Buses are finite. Every family from a safe district that shows up at a shelter takes a space from a family whose house is in the surge zone. Panic evacuation does not add safety. It redistributes it away from the people who need it. This is why you see shelter-in-place orders issued alongside evacuation orders, as happened in Spain during the current European fires, where tens of thousands were told to stay put while others were told to go. Telling people to stay is not a lesser instruction. It is an equally important half of the same operation, and it only works if the public trusts that the distinction is real. Which brings me to the part of this that is genuinely different, and that I want to treat honestly rather than either praising or condemning. Evacuation orders in China are not advisory in the way they typically are in Europe or North America. When a district is ordered to relocate, compliance is expected and enforced. There is no meaningful equivalent of the American coastal resident who decides to ride it out. That is a substantial part of why the numbers work, and there is no point pretending otherwise. The single biggest cause of death in evacuable disasters worldwide is people who did not go. Removing that variable removes most of the fatalities. It also comes with everything that comes with a state that can compel people to leave their homes, and the same capacity applied to other purposes looks very different. I am not going to pretend that trade-off does not exist. And anyone presenting this as a straightforward argument for one governance model over another is selling something. What I would say is narrower and I think defensible. The specific capability of moving a large population out of a mapped hazard zone quickly is one that the system is unusually good at, and the results on Sunday are the evidence. There is also a technology layer, and it is newer than most people realize. During Typhoon Maysak earlier this month, drones were flown continuously over affected regions in southern China to restore mobile phone connectivity for residents cut off by flooding, effectively airborne cell towers, put up over places where the ground infrastructure had failed. Alongside them, the Ministry of Emergency Management deployed 1,372 personnel from the National Fire and Rescue Force, 270 vehicles, 140 boats, and 350 specialist rescuers. In Guangxi, the China Southern Power Grid ran an integrated system combining power network data, meteorological forecasting, and AI analysis to track that storm's path and rainfall distribution in real time, monitoring critical power infrastructure around the clock and pushing maintenance priorities directly to field teams. That last one is worth noting because power restoration is what determines how quickly normal life resumes after a storm. Predicting which parts of the grid will fail before they fail and staging crews accordingly is the difference between days and weeks. Now, what this machine does not solve. On the same Sunday that 800,000 people were successfully relocated from the Guangdong coast, 10 people died in a valley in Gansu province, 1,500 kilometers inland, when a mountain torrent came down a narrow gorge into a scenic area full of campers at around 2 in the afternoon. That was not the typhoon. It was a separate event caused by short-duration heavy rainfall in the mountains above the site. And it is the exact hazard this entire system cannot address. Everything I have just described runs on lead time. The mapping, the maritime deadline, the shelter stocking, the cadre lists, the transport shutdown, all of it assumes you know roughly where the danger is going to be, roughly when, at least a day or two ahead. A typhoon is visible on satellite for days. That is what makes the machine possible. A mountain torrent gives you minutes. The rain that produces it falls on one catchment out of hundreds, often out of sight of the people it will reach, and the water arrives somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes later. No clipboard, no cadre list, no shelter network, and no drone can operate inside that window. That is the honest boundary of what happened last weekend. A country demonstrated, at enormous scale, that it can get people out of the way of something it can see coming. And on the same afternoon, it demonstrated that nobody has solved the thing you cannot see coming. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the inland flood and landslide reporting across Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, Henan, and Shandong over the coming week. The geological disaster responses activated in Jiangxi and Hunan on Saturday were preemptive, and whether they were justified will show in what happens on those slopes now that the rain has passed through. The second is whether any of the 4 response levels are escalated above level 4. That is the clearest available signal that an assessment came back worse than the initial read. The third is relief funding. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan for Guangdong recovery, earmarked for roads, water conservancy facilities, schools, and hospitals. Watch whether it is supplemented. Funding follows damage more honestly than statements do. The fourth is the resettlement figures. 800,000 people were moved. The meaningful question now is how quickly they go home, and how many cannot because their housing is damaged. That number, rather than the evacuation number, is the real measure of physical impact. The fifth is the next storm. Knoll was the 12th named system to affect China this year and the third landfall in about a month. The machine has now been run 3 times in 30 days, and the peak of the season is August and September. I want to end with the detail that I keep coming back to. At some point on Thursday or Friday last week, in an office in Guangzhou, somebody looked at a forecast track and started selecting map layers. Coastal elevation, slope stability, known substandard structures, aquaculture licenses, construction site registrations. By noon on Friday, men were coming off oil platforms in the South China Sea by helicopter. By Saturday, 418 boats were being sent to shelter in other provinces' harbors. By Saturday night, an alert went out and the train stopped. And through Saturday and into Sunday, an enormous number of ordinary local officials went to an enormous number of specific addresses that were already written down and told the people there it was time to go. And they went. At 3:50 on Sunday morning, the storm arrived and found most of the dangerous places empty. None of that is watchable. There is no footage of it, and there never will be, because the entire product of the operation is in absence, the people who are not there. It is the least dramatic thing in disaster response, and it is the only part that reliably works. We'll be watching the inland figures. In September 2013, Typhoon Usagi made landfall on the coast of Guangdong Province in southern China, carrying maximum sustained winds of 165 kilometers per hour. 25 people died. At 10 minutes to 4 on Sunday morning, the 26th of July, 2026, Typhoon Nul made landfall near the town of Pinghai, on the coast of Guangdong Province, about 80 kilometers northeast of Hong Kong, carrying maximum sustained winds of 162 kilometers per hour. Same province, same coastline, same category of storm, within 3 kilometers an hour of each other, 13 years apart. The confirmed death toll in Guangdong from Sunday's storm is, as of this recording, effectively 0. That does not make sense, not on the face of it. Typhoons do not become gentler because time passes. The Pearl River Delta has not moved, the South China Sea has not cooled, and there are more people living in the path than there were in 2013, not fewer. So something changed, and it is not the weather. In the next 25 minutes, I'll show you exactly what that something is, using China's own historical record. I'll walk through 4 typhoons that hit this same province over the past 2 decades, and what each of them cost. I'll show you the one number that explains the entire gap. I'll explain why people used to die in these storms and what specifically stopped it. And then I'll tell you what has not been solved, because there is a serious answer to that, and it involves a completely different kind of water. Let's start with the ledger, because the history here is stark and almost nobody puts it in one place. September 2003. Typhoon Dujuan struck Guangdong after passing Hong Kong. 38 people died, and around 1,000 were injured. 20 of the deaths were in Shenzhen, 9 in Huizhou. It was described at the time as the most damaging storm to hit the Pearl River Delta since 1979. It cut power and water in Shanwei and in parts of Shenzhen. Hold on to one detail from Dujuan, because we will come back to it. Many of those deaths happened when poorly built structures collapsed, specifically shacks used to house migrant workers. 16 migrant workers on a single construction site were among the dead. September 2010. Typhoon Fanapi, the strongest storm to hit China that year, made landfall in Fujian, but did its worst damage in neighboring Guangdong. The death toll climbed over several days, 33, then 55, then 70, with dozens more listed as missing at various points. Around 99,500 people had been evacuated. Some 3,765 houses collapsed. Over 42,000 hectares of farmland were damaged. Economic losses ran to 2.4 billion yuan. Parts of Guangdong recorded 64 centimeters of rain in 24 hours, the province's worst rains in a century. 5 people died when a dam burst. 25 disappeared in a rain-triggered mudslide. Helicopters had to airdrop relief supplies into cut-off counties. September 2013. Typhoon Usagi, described by meteorologists at the time as the most powerful storm on Earth that year, hit Guangdong at 165 kilometers per hour. 25 dead. August 2017. Typhoon Hato. At least 8 deaths in Guangdong, 4 in Zhuhai, 3 in Zhongshan, 1 in Zhongmen, and 8 more across the border in Macau. Around 27,000 people were evacuated to temporary shelters. Nearly 2 million households lost power, at least briefly. In Zhuhai alone, roughly 275 homes collapsed, with damage estimated at 5.5 billion yuan. 38, 70, 25, 16, and then, on Sunday, a storm of the same strength as Usagi hit the same province and, as far as the reporting currently shows, killed nobody there. Here is the number that explains it. According to Xinhua, more than 801,000 people had been relocated for safety in Guangdong by Sunday. Now put that against the historical column. Hato, 2017, around 27,000 evacuated. 8 dead in Guangdong. Fanapi, 2010, around 99,500 evacuated. A toll that climbed past 50. Knoll, 2026. More than 801,000 relocated. Effectively zero. That is roughly 30 times the Hato evacuation and 8 times the Fanapi evacuation, for a storm of comparable strength on the same coast. The death toll does not make sense as a function of the weather. It makes complete sense as a function of how many people were not standing in front of it. So let me describe what an 801,000 person relocation actually involves, because the number gets read as a statistic and it is really a description of a machine. It starts with mapping. Somebody has to know, before the storm arrives, which specific villages, fishing communities, low-lying urban districts, coastal aquaculture operations, and construction sites fall inside the projected impact zone. That is a rolling assessment updated as the forecast track tightens. Then it requires somewhere for those people to go. In practice, that means schools, gymnasiums, community halls, and government buildings designated in advance as shelters and stocked before the season rather than during the emergency. Then it requires transport, and critically, the transport has to finish before conditions deteriorate. You cannot evacuate people during a typhoon. Roads flood, visibility collapses, and moving buses full of people into rising wind is more dangerous than sheltering in place. The entire operation has to complete hours ahead of landfall, and it requires the authority to make people go. Evacuation orders in China are not advisory in the way they often are elsewhere. Whatever you think of that as a general principle, on a weekend in July on the Guangdong coast, it is a large part of why the numbers look the way they do. Alongside the relocation, the province shut itself down. High-speed rail across Guangdong was canceled. Flights were canceled in large numbers, with figures reported between several hundred at Hong Kong International alone and around 1,800 grounded across the wider affected region. Fishing fleets were called into harbor, and drone footage released by Xinhua showed boats packed into port in rows on Saturday, waiting it out. Underneath all of that sits the warning system, and it functioned exactly as designed. China uses a 4-tier color-coded weather alert system. Blue is the lowest, then yellow, then orange, then red. On Saturday evening, the National Meteorological Center issued a red typhoon warning, the first red typhoon alert issued anywhere in the country in 2026. Then, as Noel weakened after landfall, the alert was stepped down to orange, and later on Sunday to yellow. That sequence matters more than it sounds. A warning system that only ever escalates trains people to ignore it. A system that visibly comes back down when the threat recedes is one people learn to trust. And trust is the thing that determines whether an evacuation order gets obeyed. Now the deeper question. Why did people die in the old storms? Go back to Dujuan in 2003. The deaths were concentrated in collapsing structures, and specifically in shacks housing migrant workers, with 16 killed on one construction site. Go to Phanapi in 2010. Nearly 4,000 houses collapsed. A dam burst. A mudslide took 25 people. Go to Hato in 2017. 275 homes collapsed in Zhuhai alone. Notice what those have in common. Overwhelmingly, people were not killed by wind directly. They were killed by buildings, by structures that could not take the load, in an era when a great deal of the Pearl River Delta's explosive growth was housed in temporary and informal construction thrown up alongside the factories. Two things changed after that. The first is the buildings themselves. 2 decades of construction standards, enforcement, and simple replacement of informal housing with permanent structures removed an enormous share of the risk. A typhoon that flattens a shack does not flatten a reinforced concrete apartment block, and the Delta today has far more of the latter and far less of the former than it did in 2003. The second is the evacuation of the people who are still exposed. Construction sites, fishing communities, aquaculture workers, and residents of older low-lying housing are exactly the categories being moved in that 801,000 figure. The system now identifies the same populations that used to appear in the casualty lists and takes them out of the path first. There is a third factor, and I want to be honest about it, because it is the part that flatters nobody. Noel weakened fast. It came ashore at 162 kilometers per hour and dropped to tropical storm strength within hours as it moved inland. A storm that maintained intensity longer, or that arrived on a higher tide, or that stalled over the delta and dumped rain for a day, would have produced a different set of numbers regardless of how many people were moved. Preparation reduced the exposure enormously. It did not make the outcome inevitable. Some of Sunday was luck, and pretending otherwise would be the same error in the opposite direction. Which brings me to what has not been solved, and it is the most important part of this report. While Guangdong was being evacuated, the Ministry of Water Resources and the China Meteorological Administration jointly issued a red warning for flash floods, covering parts of Jiangxi, Hunan, Guangdong, Sichuan, Shaanxi, Gansu, and southeastern Xinjiang for the period from Sunday evening through Monday evening. That is a warning for a completely different hazard, across a swathe of the country far from the coast, because a typhoon does not end at landfall. Noel moved inland after Guangdong, carrying rain into Jiangxi, Hunan, and Hubei, with precipitation forecast to persist into Tuesday and to reach provinces as far north as Henan and Shandong. And here is the uncomfortable fact from the same weekend. At around 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, in the Shuangshimen Scenic Area in Weiwan County, Gansu Province, inland, northwest, and outside anything the typhoon itself touched, a mountain torrent triggered by short-duration heavy rainfall swept through a valley full of campers. 10 people were killed and 23 injured. 174 were rescued by 305 firefighters and rescue personnel. That event was not caused by Knoll. But notice the timing against that joint red flash flood warning, which covered Gansu among 6 other provinces and opened its window on Sunday evening. The torrent arrived in the early afternoon. That is the shape of the remaining problem. The Chinese system has become extraordinarily good at the hazard you can see coming for 3 days across open ocean. It has not solved, and arguably nobody has solved, the hazard that develops in one mountain catchment in under an hour and reaches people in 10 minutes. I should also correct something, because you have probably seen it. A number of outlets ran headlines this week reporting that Typhoon Knoll killed 10 people in China. Those 10 are the Gansu victims. They died roughly 1,500 kilometers from the typhoon's track in a separate weather event. The Associated Press and others reported the two separately and clearly. The merge happened downstream, because both stories carried the words China, rain, flooding, and deaths on the same day. It is a compression error, not a conspiracy, and it is worth knowing because it makes the actual story invisible. The typhoon did kill people, incidentally, but not in China. Before reaching Guangdong, Knoll clipped the extreme northern islands of the Philippines. The Philippine government's disaster agency reported 3 dead and 1 missing, with more than 9. 300 people evacuated, and 235 houses damaged. That contrast deserves stating plainly. The same storm, at lower intensity, over a country with far fewer resources and a far harder geography of scattered islands, killed 3 people. At higher intensity over Guangdong, it killed none. That is not a comment on anyone's competence. It is a comment on what money and infrastructure buy in a disaster, and it is the single clearest illustration of it you will find this year. So let me be direct about what this does and does not mean. It does not mean Guangdong was devastated. The reported physical damage was uprooted trees in Huilai County, a partially collapsed scaffolding structure in Hong Kong, flooding, and canceled transport. Hong Kong reported at least 9 people injured. It does not mean anyone was trapped. 800,000 people were relocated by the authorities. That is the opposite of trapped, and it is good news that keeps being reported as though it were bad. It does not mean the province is undamaged in a broader sense. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan, about 14.8 million US dollars, for post-disaster recovery, earmarked for restoring roads, water conservancy facilities, schools, and hospitals. That is a meaningful sum for repair. It is also, notably, nowhere near what a flattened province would require. And the national relief response was set at level 4, the lowest of 4 tiers. And it does not mean the risk is retreating. Knoll was the 12th named storm to affect China this year, and the 3rd landfall in roughly a month, following Bavi and Maysak. Knoll was slightly stronger than Bavi, which hit eastern and northeastern China about 2 weeks earlier. That compression is the thing to watch. Response capacity is finite. The same crews, shelters, stockpiles, and drainage systems handle each event in turn. Storms spaced across a season allow recovery between them. Storms arriving in close succession land on saturated ground, unrepaired infrastructure, and rested too little personnel. And the Western Pacific typhoon season historically peaks in August and September, not July. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the inland toll. Typhoon deaths in China have historically come from rain rather than wind, and they surfaced days later in inland provinces the storm reached after landfall. Watch Jiangxi, Hunan, and Hubei over the coming week, and watch for landslide reporting specifically. The second is whether the level 4 response is escalated. That is the clearest available signal that a damage assessment came back worse than the first read. The third is the recovery allocation. The 100 million yuan is a first tranche. Whether it is supplemented and by how much follows damage more honestly than any press statement. The fourth is the Philippines. 3 dead and 1 missing was the figure on Sunday. Tolls there routinely rise as reports come in from remote island municipalities, and that country storm losses consistently receive a fraction of the international coverage China's due. The fifth is what forms next in the warm pool east of the Philippines. 3 landfalls in a month, entering the strongest months of the season, is the actual story here, not any single storm. I want to end where I started, with the arithmetic that opened this. In 2013, a typhoon carrying 165 km/h winds hit Guangdong and killed 25 people. On Sunday, a typhoon carrying 162 km/h winds hit Guangdong and killed nobody there. The difference is not that the storm was weaker. The difference is that on Friday and Saturday, somebody drew a line around the parts of a province that were going to get hit, and then 800,000 people were moved out from behind it. Buses ran. Shelters opened. Boats came into harbor. Trains stopped. Somebody went out to the fishing villages and the construction sites, the same places that filled the casualty lists in 2003 and 2010, and told the people there to leave. And they left. There is no footage of that. No drone shot, no dramatic rescue, nothing that trends. It is the most boring possible form of disaster response, and on Sunday morning, it was worth roughly 25 lives compared to the last time this happened. 10 hours later, in a valley in Gansu with no warning available and no time to give one, 10 people died. That is the whole picture. One hazard we have learned to handle, one we have not. We'll be watching the inland figures. On Sunday, the 26th of July, 2 things happened in China, about 1,500 kilometers apart. A typhoon made landfall on the coast of Guangdong province at 10 minutes to 4 in the morning. It was the strongest typhoon to hit China this year. More than 800,000 people had been relocated ahead of it. As far as the reporting shows, it killed nobody in that province. 10 hours later, in a narrow valley in Gansu province, inland, northwest, far outside the storm's track, a flash flood swept through a scenic area full of campers. 10 people were killed and 23 injured. Within 24 hours, headlines around the world had combined those 2 events into one. Typhoon Noel kills 10 in southern China. I want to be precise about what went wrong, because it is not what most people assume, and the actual mechanism is more interesting and more useful than a story about lazy journalists. Here is the part that surprised me. Most of the outlets that ran that headline had the correct information in the article. If you scrolled past the headline, you would find a sentence stating plainly that rain-triggered flash floods killed 10 people in a scenic area in Gansu province. The body copy was right. The headline was wrong. And the 2 sat on the same page, contradicting each other for anyone who bothered to read past the first line. In the next 25 minutes, I'll separate the 2 events properly, show you exactly where in the publishing chain the error was introduced, explain the mechanical reasons it happens on every fast-moving disaster story, identify who got it right and what they did differently, and cover a second set of errors in the same coverage that nobody has flagged at all. And then I'll explain why this matters more than a pedantic correction. Because the merge did not just get a fact wrong, it made both real stories invisible. Let's separate them cleanly first. Event 1. Typhoon Noel, the 12th named storm to affect China this year, and the 3rd landfall in about a month. It came ashore in Huidong County, Huizhou City, Guangdong Province, at approximately 3:50 in the morning local time. with maximum sustained winds around 162 kilometers per hour. The National Meteorological Center had issued a red typhoon alert on Saturday evening, the 1st of 2026, and stepped it down to orange and then yellow through Sunday as the storm weakened inland. Reported damage, uprooted trees, a partially collapsed scaffolding structure in Hong Kong, flooding, and mass transport cancellations. Hong Kong canceled more than 410 flights and around 150 high-speed train services, and its Home Affairs Department opened 28 temporary shelters. At least 9 people were injured there. The National Disaster Relief Response for Guangdong was set at Level 4, the least severe of 4 tiers. The National Development and Reform Commission allocated 100 million yuan for recovery, earmarked for roads, water conservancy facilities, schools, and hospitals. Event 2. At around 2 in the afternoon on Sunday, a flash flood triggered by sudden heavy rainfall struck the Shuangshimen Scenic Area in Weiyuan County, Dingxi City, Gansu Province. Tourists were camping there and were trapped when the water burst through. 10 dead and 23 injured as of 6 o'clock that evening. Wu Mingguo, head of Dingxi's Fire and Rescue Detachment, reported that at least 240 people were evacuated from the scenic area, and 7 were rescued alive from trapped vehicles. A rescuer at the scene described the floodwaters widening a nearby river to more than 30 meters at its widest point, with the fast-moving, debris-laden torrent hampering the search. The National Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters activated a Level 4 flood control response for Gansu. 2 events, different provinces, different mechanisms, different agencies responding, no causal link established by any official source. Now, where did the error come in? Look at how the sentences sit next to each other in a typical wire-derived article. A paragraph about Typhoon Nul making landfall in Guangdong. Then a paragraph beginning, rain-triggered flash floods killed 10 in China's Gansu scenic area, according to Xinhua. Then a paragraph about the Level 4 response for Guangdong. Every individual sentence is accurate. The Gansu sentence names the province. Nothing in the copy claims the typhoon caused it. But the 2 events are adjacent, in one article, under one dateline, on one day. And somewhere between that copy and the front page, someone has to compress the whole thing into 8 words. The compression is where it dies. 10 dead plus typhoon landfall in one article becomes typhoon kills 10. It is not a lie anyone consciously told. It is the arithmetic of a headline field with a character limit applied to an article containing 2 separate stories. And here is why that matters so much more than it used to. Most people never read the article. They read the headline in a feed, form an impression, and move on. Some share it. The share carries the headline, not the body. So the correct information sits in paragraph 4 of a piece that 90% of its audience never opens, while the incorrect summary travels. There are 3 mechanical pressures that make this near inevitable on a story like this. The first is the wire structure. Agency copy is often written as a roundup covering multiple related events under one topic. In this case, severe weather in China on a given day. That is a sensible way to file. It becomes dangerous the moment a downstream editor needs one headline for a piece with 2 subjects, because a roundup has no single subject. The second is the aggregation chain. A story like this passes through many hands. Agency, to national outlet, to regional outlet, to aggregator, to social account. Each step compresses further, and each step inherits the previous step's headline rather than the original copy. By the 4th link, nobody is looking at the Xinhua bulletin. They are rewriting someone else's rewrite. The third is time. Both events broke inside the same news cycle, on a Sunday, competing with a typhoon landfall that was already the day's big story. Under that pressure, the flood becomes a detail inside the typhoon story, rather than its own story, because the typhoon is the frame that already exists. Notice that none of those require anyone to be dishonest or careless. This is a systems failure, and it will happen again on the next event, in exactly the same shape. So who got it right, and what did they do differently? The Associated Press and ABC News reported the two events as separate incidents, with the Gansu deaths flagged distinctly. At least one outlet running Xinhua and Reuters' copy put the province directly into the headline, a flash flood killing 10 and injuring 23 in a scenic area of Gansu, with the typhoon's landfall mentioned as the same day context rather than the cause. That is the whole fix. One word, Gansu, in the headline, and the error becomes impossible. And the specialist outlet The Watchers went further, stating explicitly that some media reports had linked the flooding to Typhoon Noel, that no official authority had confirmed such a connection, and that based on information released by Chinese authorities, the event was a localized heavy rain event producing rapid mountain flooding, independent of the typhoon. That is what accuracy looks like on a fast story. Not more words, just the location in the headline, and a willingness to state what has not been established. Now the errors nobody has flagged, because there were others in the same coverage. The first is the evacuation figure, which was reported as a single fact when it was actually a moving number. On Saturday, the figure was around 340,000. By later reporting, it was more than 700,000. One outlet published 715,351, a precise sounding number that was accurate for the moment it was captured. By Sunday, it exceeded 801,000. None of those is wrong. They are timestamps. But they were mostly published without timestamps, which means readers encountering different articles saw wildly different figures for the same event and had no way to reconcile them. If you read one piece saying 340,000 and another saying 801,000, the natural conclusion is that somebody is lying. Nobody was. The evacuation was still running. The second is the response level, and this one is genuinely confusing even for careful readers. You will find coverage stating that China activated a level 4 response, the lowest tier, and other coverage referring to a level 2 response across southern China. Both can be accurate, because China does not run one emergency system. It runs several in parallel. There is a 4-tier meteorological warning system, color-coded blue to red. There is a separate 4-tier flood control and typhoon prevention response, where level 4 is the lowest and level 1 the most severe. There is a 4-tier geological disaster response for landslides. And there is a 4-tier national disaster relief response. Different ministries, different ladders, different provinces, all active during the storm at different levels. So a headline saying China issues highest red alert and a headline saying China activates lowest level response are both true, describing different systems entirely. Read together without that context, they look like a contradiction, which is exactly the kind of gap that conspiracy narratives grow in. Now let me get to why any of this matters, because I do not think this is pedantry. The merge destroyed two stories at once. If you believe the typhoon killed 10 people in Guangdong, then the first story becomes unremarkable. Storm hits China, some people die, move on. What you miss is that the strongest typhoon to hit China this year made landfall on a coastline holding over 100 million people and killed effectively nobody there, because more than 800,000 people were moved out of the way in about 48 hours. That is a genuinely extraordinary outcome, and it went almost entirely unexamined internationally, because the headline said the storm had killed people. And the second story disappears completely. 10 people died in a valley, in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, in a place where no warning system could realistically have reached them in time. That is a hard, important story about the limits of disaster prediction, and it was absorbed into a typhoon report as a casualty figure. Both of those are more interesting than the version that ran. The error did not just misplace 10 deaths geographically. It replaced two significant stories with one boring wrong one. There is a third thing the merge hides, and it is the one with the longest reach. Gansu is not an unusual place for this to happen. In August 2025, flash floods in Yuzhong County in the same province killed 10 people, with 33 missing and around 4,000 stranded. Different county, different year, near identical toll. The reason is geology. Much of Gansu sits on the lowest plateau, hills and gullies of wind-deposited silt, one of the largest such formations on the planet. Loess erodes easily and becomes unstable when saturated, which makes the region persistently vulnerable to both flash flooding and landslides. That province has a long record of severe weather disasters, including the 2010 Jok debris flow that killed over 1,400 people, and an ultramarathon in 2021 where 21 runners died in sudden cold and gale-force winds. So the correct framing of Sunday's flood is not that a typhoon killed 10 people. It is that a recurring regional hazard in one of the most flash flood-prone landscapes on Earth killed 10 people at a tourist site on a summer weekend. That framing suggests obvious questions about where campsites are sited and what warning infrastructure exists at scenic areas. The typhoon framing suggests none of them. That is the real cost, not an incorrect fact. A set of questions that never got asked. Let me be fair about the limits of my own account here too. I am working from published reporting, and I do not have access to every newsroom's decision-making. Some outlets may have corrected their headlines after publication. Corrections rarely travel as far as the original. Some of the pieces I have seen may have been updated since, and the underlying facts remain provisional. Casualty figures after flash floods move as search areas widen, and the Gansu toll may not be final. I would also say clearly that this is not a story about one country's media being uniquely bad. This same compression happens on every fast disaster story in every language. It happened during the European wildfires this month, where evacuation totals from two countries were merged, split and re-merged across outlets within hours. So here is what I would actually suggest you take from this, practically, next time a disaster crosses your feed. First, check whether the headline names a place. Disaster headlines that name a country but not a province or city are the ones most likely to have merged something. 10 dead in China is a warning sign. 10 dead in Weiwan County, Gansu is a fact. Second, look for the timestamp on any number. Evacuation figures, casualty counts, and damage estimates on live events are snapshots. A figure without a time attached is not a fact. It is a moment. Third, if two outlets give wildly different numbers, assume a timing difference before assuming deception. That is almost always what it is. Fourth, when you see an official response level cited, check which system it belongs to. Highest alert and lowest response can coexist, and usually do. And fifth, read one paragraph past the headline. On this specific story, one paragraph would have been enough. The correction was sitting right there in the copy, under a headline that contradicted it. Here is what I'll be watching. The first is the final Gansu toll. 10 was accurate as of 6 o'clock Sunday evening. Numbers after mountain torrents move and missing persons figures reported separately are the better predictor of where the total lands. The second is whether any corrections are issued on the merged headlines. My expectation is very few, and that is worth noting rather than assuming. The third is the inland impact from Newell itself, across Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, and further north, where the rain persisted for days after landfall. If deaths occur there, they will be genuine typhoon deaths, and they will arrive after most of the coverage has moved on. The fourth is whether the work team dispatched to Gansu publishes findings on warnings and site sighting at the scenic area. I want to end on the image that stays with me. Somewhere on Sunday, an editor had an article on their screen containing two sentences. One said a typhoon had made landfall in Guangdong. The other said a flash flood had killed 10 people in Gansu. They had one headline field and a deadline, and they wrote the thing that both sentences appeared to add up to. 10 people died in a canyon in northwest China that afternoon. And the international record of how they died is, in a great many places, wrong. Not because anyone lied, but because two true sentences were sitting next to each other and somebody had to make them fit in one line. That is how most misinformation actually works. Not conspiracy. Compression. We'll be watching the final figures.